Hi, everybody. So I'm Angie Rasmussen. I'm here by myself today, which is why it's so quiet. For once, there wasn't a bunch of, oh shit, am I doing this right? Like during the intro, because I was just thinking that to myself and not actually saying it out loud. So Jessica Malati Rivera, my normal co-host, had actual meetings for her actual job, which does in fact pertain to the ongoing Bundibugyo virus outbreak. But, I have a day job too. However, we do think it's really important to provide you with updates because this situation is one that is unfolding constantly. And you really do need to know what's happening because while it's not going to become a pandemic, and I don't want to present this in a way that is fear mongering or making you think that you are about to contract Bundibugyo Ebola virus. It is a really, really serious and catastrophic situation in Central Africa, and it does actually come back and impact people in the US and elsewhere indirectly. So I think it's really, really important for people to understand what's happening, and more importantly, why is it happening? It is happening because the US has effectively abandoned its commitments to global health and global security throughout the world. And that's why, unfortunately, we are seeing this rare species of Ebola virus emerging today. So let's talk about what the situation actually is. There are 6 species of Ebola viruses, and 4 of them can infect and cause disease in humans. 3 of them have caused outbreaks in humans. And this is the most rare of those 3. This is only the 3rd outbreak that it has caused. It is called Bundibugyo or Bundibugyo. It seems that the hard G team is winning out. So against how I've pronounced this word since I first learned it from somebody who pronounced it with the soft G, I'm going to start saying Bundibugyo virus. Bundibugyo virus is a type of Ebola virus that has emerged. It emerged first in 2007 in Uganda. It emerged again in 2012 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And now, as we learned last week, it has emerged again in the Democratic Republic of Congo and has spread to Uganda. Currently, there are more than 500 suspected cases. I will caution that there hasn't been a lot of diagnostic testing done, so we don't actually know that all of these are, in fact, Ebola cases, but there are quite a number of suspected cases. There have been 131 suspected deaths at last count. That probably will continue to increase. Over time, as samples are becoming available for testing, they're confirming these with molecular diagnostics as they can. Now, there have been 2 imported cases in Uganda. The WHO announced yesterday in their first situation report that there are 12 suspected cases in Uganda. The Ugandan Ministry of Health, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, says that there have only been those 2 imported cases. One of those died. They are doing contact tracing. The Ministry of Health in Uganda actually has quite a lot of experience responding to filovirus outbreaks. Same thing for the Democratic Republic of Congo, since this is their 17th Ebola virus outbreak. They've had outbreaks of Ebola viruses numerous times. And in fact, the Democratic Republic of Congo is where Ebola first emerged when it was Zaire in 1976. So it is long experienced with Ebola viruses. And even though Bundibugyo virus is not the same thing as Ebola virus, they are different species of the same type of virus, it still causes Ebola virus disease. So for all intents and purposes, what you need to know about this is that this is an Ebola virus. It's causing an outbreak of Ebola. And the outbreak is really huge. And we didn't detect this outbreak until it was already at more than 200 suspected cases. So that unfortunately makes it really difficult to contain. In addition to that, the circumstances where this outbreak occurred make it very difficult to contain. So this region is a conflict zone. Reports anyways seem to indicate that this first emerged in association with mining towns where there is a workforce that is very migratory. There are day laborers who come in and work in the mines. People travel around quite a bit. And so that allows people to, get infected potentially with something and then take it to another city or another place. In addition to that, this is basically a war zone. There are a number of different rebel groups. I'm not an expert in this area, So I'm not going to comment on the nature of the conflict other than to say that there is a lot of conflict. On the other side of the border in South Sudan, just north of the area that has been affected, there are large refugee camps, and there has been a presumptive positive as of yesterday in the province of South Sudan where these refugee camps are. So that is an extremely concerning development. The idea of an Ebola outbreak occurring in a refugee camp where you have a lot of people in really close proximity, there's not adequate sanitation, there's not adequate food or medical care, is a humanitarian disaster that we have not seen yet. And please believe me, we don't want to. So that's something to watch. And then today we also just learned that a case has been identified in South Kivu in an area that has been controlled by one of the rebel militia groups. This case traveled from another city called Kisangani, which is also quite a large distance. So this makes containment in terms of contact tracing, in terms of doing the epidemiology that you need to do to understand exactly how this virus is spreading and cut off these transmission chains, is going to be very, very complicated, just because of the fact that it is very difficult to access many of the people who have been affected. And they're a highly mobile population. And in some cases, they are actually fleeing from armed violence and armed conflict. So that makes this whole situation very, very difficult to even understand how big this outbreak is, much less where all of the patients are. Now, for a long time, we did not have vaccination to help control Ebola outbreaks. We did not have monoclonal antibodies or other treatments besides supportive care. That's what we're looking at in this outbreak in terms of what we need to provide these patients with. So if somebody is exposed to Ebola, if somebody begins to show symptoms for Ebola or test positive for Ebola, they need to be isolated, but they also need to be given adequate supportive care. We've seen in the West African outbreak, before we had a vaccine available for Ebola virus, again, different species of Ebola virus. Ebola virus is a different virus from Bundibugyo virus, but they are both Ebola viruses. And I'm sorry, I did not invent the taxonomy, and that's a rant for another time. But anyways, we have a vaccine for Ebola virus, and that's what caused the West African epidemic in 2014 to 2016. For most of that epidemic, though, we did not actually have a vaccine available. We had to use the tail end of that epidemic, and then the 2017 epidemic that came afterwards, we used to do clinical trials. And since then, that vaccine's been approved. Ring vaccination has been an important part of controlling Ebola outbreaks. But we didn't always have that, and we didn't have that up until a few years ago. So before that, what we did was good old-fashioned epidemiology, contact tracing, isolation, quarantine, and then providing really good supportive care. And we saw, for example, all of the Americans who were evacuated back to the US got world-class supportive care. They all survived. You know, Ebola is not an easy disease to have. It's not like, oh, well, you know, that was a bad couple of days. Now I'm back on my feet again. I mean, they were very, very sick and they could have died. But that excellent supportive care they got, that treatment that they received, probably made a real difference in terms of saving their lives. And so that's the kind of care that we need to be providing to the people on the ground who are being affected in the outbreak zone. But given these conditions, it's incredibly challenging to do that. It is incredibly challenging. And if you look at the numbers, we have all these suspected cases and barely any tests done. That's because there's not necessarily reagents available to do those tests with. There's not PCR machines. There's not machines that are the right kind of PCR machines, because molecular diagnostics these days are often done using these platform systems. And if your virus, which this is, again, a very, very rare virus that won't be detected by other tests for other Ebola viruses, you're not going to detect it. So that means you have to set up entirely new molecular diagnostic systems. And again, this part of the world is very difficult to access. There's a lot of problems with mobility, with moving around. And the biggest problem, I think, is the fact that a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the resources that the US used to invest in this part of the world are now gone because of the cuts that have occurred at the US Agency for International Development, or USAID. So the gutting of USAID has demonstrably made many places that were already unstable more prone to conflict and violence. It has already begun decreasing life expectancy and increasing the mortality rate of people who live in these areas, precisely because those resources, the investments that USAID made in terms of infrastructure, in terms of training, in terms of providing healthcare to people, are now gone, and they're not coming back. The US has said that, we're fully participating in this, but that's just simply not possible because they've taken all the money away. And on top of that, they've withdrawn from the World Health Organization. Now, a lot of people say, oh, the World Health Organization doesn't know what they're doing, or they screwed up the COVID pandemic, or blah, 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 blah. They didn't acknowledge airborne transmission in time. They've made mistakes, whatever. The WHO is absolutely critically important for coordinating global responses to outbreak emergencies like this. They are composed of human beings, so they're not perfect. Outbreak situations like this are incredibly complex, usually for reasons that are also of human making. So you can't expect the World Health Organization to perfectly respond to everything that happens. It doesn't mean that they don't have a critically important role in organizing responses to this. And historically, the WHO and the US worked closely together to make sure that responses to diseases like this that have the potential to cause death on a global scale, or at least a regional scale, and whether something's going to become a pandemic or not, I think it's still pretty important to take care of it if it's going to potentially kill thousands and thousands of people, even if that doesn't happen to be where I live. So, the World Health Organization in the US really historically have played a critical role in making sure that these outbreaks do get contained before they turn into what this has turned into. Unfortunately, the US claims that we're doing a fantastic job. They said the other day in this really dumb press conference that I listened into that they were going to be putting $13 million towards this response effort. Now, $13 million is not a lot of money. They've since said that it's going to be actually $23 million. So, okay, that's still not a lot of money. They claim that they're going to build 50 Ebola treatment clinics with this money. I don't think that that's going to be the case because the Ministry of Health in Uganda yesterday put out this tweet that said that basically, we don't know what you're talking about. You haven't built any of these facilities here. We have no idea what your plans are to build these facilities here, and you haven't reached out or talked to us. Now, that's kind of interesting because while the US has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, supposedly what the US is doing instead of the World Health Organization is signing all these bilateral agreements because I don't know why multilateralism is not cool unless it's like the Board of Peace or something. So now we're just going to like one-on-one negotiate with every country how we're going to deal with global health issues, including outbreak response. So we should actually have an agreement in place with Uganda, but apparently that doesn't involve actually talking to their Ministry of Health about all of the clinics that we're supposedly going to build there. And, this is typical of the US government these days where, they say something and then they get exposed as clowns and, oh, LOL, like they're also incompetent. And that is all true. The problem is at the basis of this is a lot of really, really dark shit. So the Imperial College of London have a world-class infectious disease modeling unit there. And every time there's like a pandemic, those Imperial modelers get up to this every single time. They come out with a study where they're trying to predict the size of the disease outbreak, the impact potentially that it will have. They did this at the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And oh boy, do I remember those days when it's like, have you read the Imperial Modeling Study? And it's like, oh my God, I'm trying to wrap my head around these numbers. The Imperial Modeling Study laid out several different parameters for the COVID-19 pandemic. And while it wasn't as bad as their worst case scenario, some of their predictions were pretty close in terms of the death toll that the COVID-19 pandemic ultimately took. So, their models are always useful, but never right. There's this old saying that Models are always wrong, but they're sometimes useful. That's true for this. Basically, what this model says is they've projected that there are 400 to 900 cases of this. That's how big this outbreak is. I don't know that we can say that. Yesterday, former CDC director Tom Frieden posted, a graph of the trajectory of different Ebola outbreaks, and it shows that this one is practically a straight line, showing that it's accelerating rapidly. But we do have to keep in mind that we just didn't detect this until there were already 200 cases. So given the mobility of the population, the complexity of the environment, that makes it really, really hard to project accurately how many cases there might be, because we just don't actually know where the people who might have been exposed have gone. And to make things worse, a lot of these suspected cases may actually end up not being Ebola. There are a lot of other diseases in this area, including malaria, that can actually look like Ebola. Now, my specialty, and I know I kind of talk about generic virus stuff, but my actual scientific specialty is Ebola pathogenesis. So that is the process by which Ebola causes disease in its host. And I study it from the perspective of the host, because something that my work has shown is that if you take the same dose of Ebola virus and you put it into a bunch of mice that are all mice, they're all the same species, but they're different genetically from each other, the same way that people would be different genetically from each other. We're all the same species, but we're obviously not genetically identical. You will have some mice that get really sick, they develop hemorrhagic disease, and they die. They get Ebola. They get full-blown Ebola virus disease. We get some that will die, they'll get sick, no evidence of hemorrhagic disease. And we get some that lose a little bit of weight, they get a little bit sick, and they recover. They essentially have mild Ebola. So Ebola, the same virus that can be very, very pathogenic in one host, can actually be fairly mild in another. And that is one thing that I find very fascinating. That's why I study it. I find it intellectually interesting, but I think it's also really relevant when we're talking about looking for an Ebola outbreak, because if you have something that causes vague symptoms and the classical symptoms, hot zone, Ebola, blood everywhere, whatever, aren't happening, it could look a lot like malaria. It could look a lot like some type of gastroenteritis, because I think a lot of other people don't appreciate how much vomiting and diarrhea can be involved with Ebola virus disease. They even changed the name of Ebola hemorrhagic fever to Ebola virus disease to reflect the fact that it's not always hemorrhagic fever in terms of people are bleeding everywhere. Oftentimes the hemorrhagic disease itself is something that you can tell from labs and not necessarily by looking at a person, because Outbreak was not actually a very accurate depiction of Ebola virus disease. So this is a real problem, because we don't know what, just looking at people clinically or hearing their descriptions of their symptoms, we don't know that that's necessarily Ebola. We could have some people who have mild cases of Bundibugyo virus, or we could have people who have cases of malaria, and it's not actually Ebola. There's other hemorrhagic fevers that are endemic to this part of Africa too. So, one of the real challenges here is trying to even figure out which of these suspected cases are actually Ebola and which ones are not. And again, in the 2014 to 2016 West African epidemic, the US sent over 3,000 troops to West Africa to help set up actually logistics, provide security for testing facilities so that people could actually get tested and determine whether or not they actually had Ebola. Because if they have malaria or something, you can treat them for malaria, and the treatments for some of these diseases are different. So you want to be able to make sure that you can discriminate those things. And again, without the US's investment, the WHO has mobilized mobile labs. They are setting them up. They are increasing their testing capacity. But again, these challenges just make it really difficult. And we have a lot of problems in terms of distrust as well, because the US has abandoned this area, because conflict has returned. Now we are seeing reports like this, where different NGOs, different facilities and organizations that are involved in the response to the outbreak are actually being targeted and attacked. One of the major issues is conducting safe burial practices. So there are two major mechanisms for transmitting Ebola viruses. One is in a healthcare setting, and another is in the situation where you are preparing a body for burial, and you are or attending a funeral. Now, during the West African epidemic early on, there were a number of funerals that were associated with super spreading events where people came from cities, attended the funeral, went back home, and brought Ebola with them, because dead bodies of patients who have died from Ebola are actually really, really dangerous in terms of transmission risk. When people have Ebola virus disease, they are viremic. They are very viremic, which means they have very, very high titers of infectious virus in their blood. That means that they have very high titers of infectious virus in their lymphatic fluids. And when, it's hard to put this in an elegant and not gross way, but when you die, a lot of those fluids come out. And so when you're preparing a body for burial, there's a lot of opportunity for contact with those bodily fluids that, again, do have high titers of infectious virus in them. And people who are involved in preparing bodies for burial, people who are paying their last respects to their loved one, touching the body, that has been associated in the past with a lot of Ebola transmission. So it is really complicated, but it is really important to have this expertise, cultural sensitivity, people from all sorts of different backgrounds, from community healthcare workers to people who are training people, to people who are technical experts, to people who are epidemiologists, to everybody under the sun you need on the team to make sure that you're working closely with the international community, as well as the community of people who are being affected. The US has completely pulled out of that. And now as a result, we are seeing infectious challenges that are the direct result of our neglect of these areas that we have deep, deep experience in addressing. So this is a real problem. And I mean, the US's attitude about this as an American is what offends me, I think, the most about this. So, there was a report about an Air France flight that was bound for Detroit and was diverted to Montreal because there was a passenger on board who just happened to be from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There was no indication that this person had been anywhere near the outbreak zone. There was no indication that this person had been exposed in any way or was in any way a risk. And they diverted the flight to Montreal, removed the passenger because of the travel ban that the US has implemented. And let me just explain why travel bans are really stupid and they won't work. Let's pretend that this Congolese passenger did in fact have Ebola, or was actually a risk. So they take him, dump him in Canada, which is fine because here in Canada, we have a lot of expertise too. And we're also very polite. So I'm sure he was well taken care of. And I'm sure that there were a lot of sorries given to him. But then they just took the plane with all the passengers on it into the US without screening them, without doing any kind of epidemiology work. And that's just not how viruses work. So if this passenger had actually been exposed and not, unfortunately, the victim of racism, that passenger would need to be isolated. And the people on the plane with that passenger would now be contacts of that passenger, and they would need to be quarantined and monitored in case they develop symptoms. From what I can tell, this plane just went on to Detroit and everybody went through customs as usual and all good. I mean, so basically you're just taking the passenger off because he's got a passport from the DRC. You're not worried about any exposure risk to anybody else. I mean, I think that just goes to show that this is definitely not about concerns that we might bring Ebola into the US. It's about concerns that we might let Congolese people into the US and we don't want them here. It seems that we don't even want Americans here, though, who might have Ebola, because also the Washington Post has now reported that it was the White House, and I've been hearing this for the last several days, but the Washington Post reported that it was the White House that refused to let the doctor with Ebola return to the US. Now, the doctor's wife is also a physician who was separately involved in a high-risk exposure when she performed an ultrasound on an Ebola patient who was pregnant, which is one of the highest risk healthcare settings you could possibly perform that procedure in. They were sent to Germany, and don't get me wrong, my colleagues in Germany are excellent. Charity Hospital is a perfectly adequate facility to take them to, but they basically spent a very long time trying to take them there instead of bringing them home to the US, where we have multiple purpose-built facilities for this exact scenario, where this exact scenario saved the lives of many of my colleagues and friends during the West African outbreak when they were evacuated from West Africa. And there were no cases of transmission within the US from patients who were brought to these facilities. The White House did not want people with Ebola in the country, even if they were Americans, even if they were at risk, even if they would have benefited from the massive investment we've made in biocontainment units and caring for patients with these serious diseases. They were rejected by our own country. And I would say that it is really because, Trump's attitude towards this has not changed since 2014. Keep them out of here. But I think it's really important for all Americans to understand he's applying this to American citizens as well. He doesn't want Americans to be brought home should they get Ebola. Now, this doctor was deployed with a Christian medical missionary organization that was providing medical care for people in this part of the world because they believe, according to their Christian beliefs, that it is important to do that. I would agree with that. President Trump is a Christian and talks frequently about his passion for his Christian beliefs and his Christian faith. So one would think that he wouldn't be punishing people for living their Christian values and providing care for the sick in places where they can't afford that and where they don't have access to that kind of treatment because of what the U.S. has done in terms of gutting USAID and foreign aid. So people do be aware, if your government won't want you, if you happen to get one of the worst infectious diseases that you can possibly get, and even though the U.S. is fully equipped to help you, the president just doesn't want you there. So this is a real problem, and I don't know how to deal with it other than to get these people out of office, which is why I keep talking about it. But I do want Americans and everybody watching to understand that your risk for Ebola is low, but your risk because of this is very, very high. It's not necessarily Ebola that's going to cause the next big pandemic. Ebola doesn't spread person to person by the respiratory route very efficiently, even though you can get it from inhaling it. It is not like the flu, and it is not like COVID in terms of its potential to cause a pandemic. However, just because it's not going to cause a pandemic doesn't mean that it can't cause huge epidemics that are going to kill thousands of people. And even if you're not one of those people who happens to get infected with it, you are still at risk because of it. Because what the depletion of these systems says is that we are all being made more vulnerable. We are made more vulnerable to infectious threats. We are made more vulnerable to security threats. It's not going to have no impact when the US voluntarily allows thousands of people to die of a horrible disease because politically we just can't be bothered to invest in it anymore. Think about the impact that that's going to have on the US's reputation on the world stage and on Americans in general. Personally, those are not consistent with my values as an American. And that's why I think it's really important to tell people that that is what is being sent out into the world. And I think it's our moral obligation to speak up and oppose that. Now, I just have one last thing today for this little news update because I can't believe I've been talking for a half hour straight. Actually, I can. But I'm going to try to continue to keep it tight and update focused so I'm not doing any monologues. I'll save that for another time. But I just do want to talk about the misinformation environment that we are in. Now, this gentleman claims to be a virologist, although I'd never heard of him until he was brought to my attention on TikTok. And he's a physician. I'm sure he's treated some viral infections before in his patients. But he said some stupid shit about hantavirus a while back, and now it seems he's saying the same stupid shit about Ebola virus. And specifically, the stupid shit that I don't like that he's saying is, quote, the genetic sequence of this virus shows it is a, quote, unique version. We are the least prepared for this. Okay, we are the least prepared because of USAID defunding. And I don't know about this other agencies that stockpile PPE. USAID did a lot more than stockpile PPE, but okay, Terror Bear. What I have a problem with is his sequence analysis. Now, he did this same stuff for hantavirus. I don't understand these people who are like, I want it to be a new variant. But try as you might, it's not, Terry. Okay, this is a phylogenetic tree that my colleagues who are actually viral evolution experts put out on the website virological.org. It's operated by Andrew Rambo, who is a viral evolutionary guy at the University of Edinburgh and is one of the world's greatest experts on viral evolution, talking to a number of my colleagues who are actually experts in this. And also just myself being able to read a phylogenetic tree. I'm not an expert in this area, but I do know what this shows. And let me tell you, see this red stuff here in the middle, this little clade in the middle? These are the Bundabugia sequences from this current outbreak. There's not very many of them because, again, we're having trouble getting samples. We're having trouble doing PCR, much less sequencing them. But we do have a couple sequences. What this shows is that they're very similar to both of these viruses that have previously emerged. So the green and the yellow are viral sequences from the two previous Bundabugia virus outbreaks. The red is from this outbreak. Oh, look, they all cluster together. They're not that unique. It's a regular Bundabugia virus, okay? No variants. We don't need to be talking about Ebola variant speculation. This outbreak is bad enough without these tourists essentially coming in and being like, oh, there's a couple of mutations. We got a variant on our hands. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Anybody who says stuff like this doesn't know what they're talking about. Get your information from somebody like me. And if it's a topic that I'm not an expert in, I do know experts in a lot of these topics. So I'll send you to somebody that you can trust. Don't listen to some old dude on TikTok who's like, hi, I'm Dr. Terry, and doesn't know how to spell hantavirus. He spelled it with a U, guys. I don't want to throw stones in a glass house, but do be suspicious of old people who try to become influencers on Instagram or Substack. Anyways, that's it for today's update. I'll be back tomorrow morning, maybe with Jess, to talk about it some more, because I'm sure plenty of horrible things will have happened between now and then in terms of this situation. And I do know that sometimes I make jokes about it, but that's because honestly, even though this isn't going to become an Ebola pandemic, the reality is that this is already a huge catastrophe. And it is a very, very serious situation. And everybody needs to understand that even though you might not personally be at risk of getting this virus, this entire outbreak puts us at risk because it shows how completely depleted and incapable our whole system is to deal with emerging threats. So on that cheerful note, have a great day, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.